Anglo-American bosses spent vast resources to influence ANC leaders and alongside covert intelligence gathering networks, shaped financial policy in the years of transition from the apartheid state to democracy. Hello everyone, welcome back to Morning Shot. A new book is out by the deputy editor of News 24, Piet du Toit, and he talks about how Anglo-American basically ingratiated themselves to the ANC before the ANC actually took power in 1994. Well, here's the interesting part about this particular article. So, if you read on, right, we do understand that business really didn't like the National Party. And I sort of understand that it was a bit of a socialist state. There were lots of sanctions, there was economic decline. I really get that. But when Anglo Americans state quite happily that they helped fund the ANC, they're talking about people, based on the quote from the book, on people who had nothing. These are ANC people who've never been in South Africa. They were in exile for years. They had large families. And really, they didn't have any sense of having A, capital, and B, knowledge about how a modern economy works. In fact, according to the book, the ANC members didn't even know that South Africa was a modern Western economy. And therefore, Anglo American sort of thought to themselves, well, if we can ingratiate ourselves to the ANC, we can help them become more capitalistic. I'm not too sure the repercussions of that decision flow very well to this day.
Yeah, so obviously this is the ANC's idea that it was ultimately set up as a socialist type party, which is detailed in the Freedom Charter. In other words, everything within the state should be in the remit of the government, and the government should own everything. Now we can obviously see the consequences of that today. So obviously when the ANC inherited the economy was in ruins, obviously because of decades of sanctions. Those sanctions had ultimately led to the collapse of apartheid and obviously led to the Rainbow Nation being formed. We all know the stories and we've all seen the films. Okay, so the idea behind Anglo American, which is a JSE listed company at the time, was if we fund the ANC, being basically a party that doesn't really know what it's doing, what we could effectively do is get it to move away from the Soviet era doctrines that it liked to push, this Marxist type thing of nationalization, and we can get it towards what I suppose you could describe as modern liberalism in a Western economy, which is obviously what they did. So the book details that through many meetings, they sat down with the ANC and guided with them a way that a modern economy should look and run. And as a result, they had what ultimately became a more liberalized and more capitalist type economy. Now, what the article doesn't obviously go on to say is that that actually did have some good effects because towards the end of the Mandela era and the start of the Mbeki era, South Africa saw good economic growth. But the lack of socialism within the ANC didn't last for long because ultimately in the Zuma era, there was a return to socialist type dogma, which we obviously saw with the rise of the South African Communist Party. And the South African Communist Party itself would often lament that the ANC had chosen to side itself with capitalism, saying that that capitalism had got itself into the economy and it had obviously slowed down the National Democratic Revolution. And obviously, the consequences now of that increase in socialist type dogma can be felt today, where we have the state that we live in. What's your view on this, Ramon?
So I hate to bang on this point, but really, we need to really understand what Anglo American did to those ANC leaders. And I quote from the article: ANC leaders were cash strapped, and Anglo American like facilitated cars, homes, employment, and put them in proximity of power. The problem with this, Byron, is that in the late 80s, early 90s, the ANC had zero political power, or very, very little. The struggle was a waste of time. Nothing materialized from it. And it just seems like Anglo American knew exactly when the chickens would come home to roost. It almost as if Anglo wanted the ANC to win in 1994 and made sure it did win. Obviously, they say, oh, it was for self-interest, but also to make sure that the ANC becomes capitalistic. But if the ANC becomes capitalistic, it's very good for Anglo American, right? But there was no hope in hell that the ANC would win 94. It wasn't obvious in the late 80s. It wasn't obvious until maybe 92 that maybe they have a chance of winning 1994. So the real question is, what responsibility does Anglo American have in ensuring that the ANC actually won 94, which was a highly fraudulent election? And what responsibility does Anglo American have in the state we are in today, which is a complete and utter nightmare, as you well know?
Stop playing yourself. You need help to run a business. At Morning Shot Accelerator, we do all the heavy lifting so you don't have to. Labor management is time-consuming, frustrating, and costly. Whether you're under the weather or over the moon, our virtual assistants are eager to meet your daily administrative needs. Phone calls, appointments, social media management, and more. Enjoy all the benefits of having employees. No red tape or added costs involved. Accelerate your success with Morning Shot Accelerator. Contact us on info@morningshot.co.za to scale your business today.
So obviously we were talking about this before we actually started recording this segue. And the interesting part about it is obviously when everything started to go tits up in South Africa, which it has now, obviously due to ANC policy, one of the first things that Anglo America did is went to London. So we see this quite a lot in all the so-called Karens around the country that often criticize everything to do with every other party that's not the ANC and commonly tries to virtue signal their way out of any struggle. And as we often say, even on this channel, the minute the going gets tough, the tough go to Australia. And we've seen that now in a JSE listed company do the exact same thing. So they created the mess. They tried to capitalize on it. I suppose they did capitalize on it for a few years. And then obviously when it became too difficult to capitalize on it due to socialist policy in the country, the labor unions being too strong, the labor law not being very good, crumbling infrastructure, mass strikes that are obviously burning infrastructure. What does Anglo America do? Goes to London. What's your view on that?
Well, it's the white thing to do. That's all I'm going to say. It's like the white thing to do, right? They're very proud of their transformation, the history of transformation Anglo-American, but we're not going to put any money or funds or capital or skin in the game in the country that we helped fuck up. That's the white thing to do when there's nothing more to say in this particular regard. But Byron, the most important question for you is, the 94 election was extremely fraudulent. To this day, we will never know whether it was really the will of the people or, I mean, there was so much violence. There was the first big election for millions of people. It was always going to be a nightmare. I wonder if Anglo did not help the ANC, assuming the ANC did come back and they were like uneducated, had no jobs, had no money, had no cars, had no planes. Anglo even gave them planes. What the outcome of that election would be? I suspect it would have been so much more different. I doubt the ANC would even get a proper majority.
Yeah, I mean, we've often said this, and it's a failure of South African history to consider what may have been. But obviously, at the dawn of democracy in this country, interestingly enough, the party that was more popular than the ANC was the IFP. What could an IFP-led government have led for South Africa, considering that the IFP is, in their own wiki page, if you could have a look it up yourself, it's anti-communist. It's the exact opposite of the ANC. So it's very interesting to see what could have been. Obviously, when the ANC came in '94, it had good economic growth. That economic growth led to a lot of people obviously suddenly getting jobs and the economy growing again, which meant that in '98, the election results were overwhelmingly positive for Thabo Mbeki. And he presided over a very good economy all the way until, 2008?
Fake news. It was the election was in '99, Byron. Sorry. There are some haters out there that will want to fact check us, so I'm just doing it before they destroy our comments.
And I thank you for doing that, because you're very correct. There are some fact checkers out there that will go absolutely bananas over it. So thank you, Ramon.
Anyway.
99, the election was, and obviously it ran for some time until the Jacob Zuma era. And what's interesting is that economic growth was attributed to ANC policy at the time. Can you believe it? And obviously, it wasn't really ANC policy. It was probably policy written for it by Anglo America. And ultimately, it got the ANC back in power. So what would have happened if it had been Anglo America pushing the IFP? Arguably, we won't be in this mess now, because we may have actually had a more stable foundation of liberalism to work on. Not that we're liberals, by the way. I'm talking in jest.
And the IFP, they're just anti-commies, which is good enough. But unfortunately for them, the only reason the ANC was seen as the last vanguard of the black masses in the late 80s, early 90s was because they killed everyone else that had belonged to Azapo, that belonged to IFP, that belonged to black consciousness, all through the People's War. And there's a whole video on our channel, if you go right to the top of the documentaries, about the People's War and Nelson Mandela's role in it. So, yeah. So, Anglo-American hedged its bets. It made a good call at the time for itself, not for the country. And at the end of the day, maybe Julius Malema is completely right. White Monopoly Capital runs the show and has been since way before 1994.
I don't really buy that, though. I really don't. I mean, obviously, Julius's argument that Anglo America may have been pushing it and White Monopoly Capital may have been pushing it, I don't really think that holds true post the Zuma era. I think once you get the Zuma era, you start finding things like the Guptas coming in, and rather than it being mining companies that are pushing South Africa, you've got like diamond smugglers and cigarette smugglers. It's kind of like all the resource miners disappeared around 2010 and all the smugglers took over. And I think you can see that even in modern South African policy, it's all like the rise of the smuggler. But, is the modern economy still controlled by white monopoly capital? No, I'm skeptical of that, man. I think the modern economy is captured by criminals and nothing more.
Yeah, by Zamazamas and gangs of drug addicts. But anyway, that is the story for today. Let us know in the comments below, should Anglo-American be hauled before The Hague for war crimes against the South African people because they supported the ANC way before it was cool? Or should we just let them live in London peacefully, raking in billions and billions of dollars, destroying our environment? So let us know in the comments down below.